Drive across the Benicia Martinez Bridge on Interstate 680, look down, and you'll see them. Dozens of gray warships anchored in tight rows in the middle of a California marsh. No sailors, no engines, just empty decks streaked with rust and paint peeling into salmon water. Some of these hulls carried a president. One won a world war. Another was a secret spy ship. At its peak, this hidden fleet held hundreds of ships, a whole navy mothballed and waiting. Then it started poisoning the bay beneath it, and nobody in charge wanted to admit why the ships were still there. That fleet has a name most people never learn. Officially, it is the Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet. To everyone in the Bay Area, it was the Mothball Fleet, or the Ghost Fleet. And it exists because in 1945 the United States won a war and immediately had a problem it did not know how to solve. By the end of World War II, America was holding thousands of surplus cargo ships, tankers, and support vessels. Too many to crew, too expensive to run, but far too valuable and too politically awkward to simply cut up for scrap. So in 1946, the government chose a third option: park them. The National Defense Reserve Fleet would keep hundreds of ships in cold storage, floating, maintained just enough to be reactivated for the next war in a matter of days to a few months. They needed somewhere to put them. Suisun Bay, a brackish tidal estuary northeast of San Francisco, was almost perfect. The water was calm and sheltered. It was deep enough to float a battleship, around 46 feet at the foot of the anchorage. It sat just a short tow from the dry docks at Mare Island, where a sleeping ship could be brought back to life. The lane they marked out ran 4.5 miles long and half a mile wide, beginning just north of the Union Pacific Railroad Bridge. Everything that made Suisun Bay a perfect parking lot would later make it a perfect trap. But nobody was thinking about that yet. When the anchorage opened, it held 125 ships. Within a few years, it held hundreds. Nationwide, by 1950, the reserve program swelled past 2,200 vessels across 8 sites, and Suisun was the largest on the West Coast. Row after row of hulls, lined up bow to stern, tied together, a forest of steel and wires sitting in a marsh full of migrating birds and spawning salmon. The man who would spend his career tending that forest was Joe Pecoraro, who started managing the fleet in 1991. His father had a nickname for the place. Joe's Rusty Navy, he called it. We had a lot of rust. That rust is the whole story. It just took 40 years to turn dangerous. Because here's what the brochures never said. Every hull was coated in thick, decades-old paint, lead, zinc, copper, the anti-fouling chemistry of the 1940s. As long as crews scraped and repainted, it was fine. But a mothballed ship has no crew. It has caretakers who pump water out of the hull to keep it from sinking, and little else. Left in salt air and tide, that paint doesn't just fade, it sheds, it falls. These ships were supposed to wait for a war, then sail again in weeks. Most of them never moved under their own power again. For a while, the model actually worked. When Korea erupted, the country reached into its mothballed reserve and pulled out roughly 540 ships nationwide. During Vietnam, another 172 were reactivated. Each time, the argument for Suisun Bay looked airtight. Why scrap a fleet when a war could need it back overnight? So the ships kept coming. Over the decades, close to 1,000 vessels passed through the anchorage, and by the early 1950s, the rows here held around 340 at once, the fullest the Forest of Steel would ever get. And it was not a boring fleet. That's what people forget. Ron Patterson, who ran tour cruises out to the rows on his Dolphin charters, put it simply: every ship was like a little textbook of history. He wasn't exaggerating. Threaded into those anonymous gray hulls were vessels with astonishing lives. One of them was the tugboat Hoga, the little boat that fought fires and dragged ships clear of the flames during the attack on Pearl Harbor. It survived the worst day in American naval history, then spent decades quietly rusting in a California marsh. Another was the Hughes Glomar Explorer, built under a Howard Hughes cover story for a genuine CIA operation to raise a sunken Soviet submarine off the ocean floor. A real Cold War spy ship parked in the rows like an old barge. There was the Hassayampa, a 655-foot fleet oiler once called the most decorated of its kind, that had refueled the fleet across the Pacific. Then, in 2001, the crown jewel arrived. The battleship USS Iowa, 887 feet of steel, 9 16-inch guns that could hurl a 2,700-pound shell 23 miles, the ship that carried Franklin Roosevelt across the Atlantic with a bathtub installed just for him. The Iowa had lost 47 sailors in a 1989 turret explosion. Now, decommissioned, she was towed 5,443 miles from Rhode Island through the Panama Canal to sit in Suisun Bay among the ghosts, the most powerful class of battleship ever built, waiting in a marsh. You didn't need a boat to feel the scale. Caltrans built a Vista Point off Highway 680 just so drivers could pull over and stare at an armada of anchored warships. That's the strange thing about this hidden fleet. It hid a spy ship and a Pearl Harbor hero in plain sight, next to a commuter bridge, in full view of anyone with a windshield. Up close, though, the spectacle thinned out. Because the men who actually worked the fleet weren't preparing ships for war. They were fighting a slow war against water. Caretakers boarded leaking hulls to pump them out over and over, just to keep them floating. The paint that once meant readiness was flaking off the decks in sheets. Joe Pecораro's lot of rust wasn't a joke. It was a job description. For veterans, none of that mattered. Men like Russ Munn, who'd served in the 1950s, treated the anchorage as sacred ground, driving to the Martinez Marina to find, through binoculars, the same class of ship he'd once crewed. To them, the fleet was heritage. To the agency that owned it, it was becoming a liability nobody wanted to book. The ships were too old to fight, too expensive to reactivate, and the market was about to decide they weren't worth saving at all. For decades, nobody outside that agency asked what was sliding off those hulls into the water. Then, in 2006, one person noticed. What he noticed sounded harmless. Someone was cleaning the ship's hulls in the water. But cleaning a hull in the bay means scraping paint and marine growth straight into it. The tip reached David Elias at the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, and when he went out to inspect, he found something worse than sloppy maintenance. They'd been sitting there since World War II and were in very bad shape, he said. These ships are enormous, and there's a lot of paint. Then a reporter did the thing agencies dread. In 2007, Thomas Peel of the Contra Costa Times filed a Freedom of Information Act request and pulled MARAD's own study. The number in it was staggering. The fleet had already shed an estimated 20 tons of heavy metals, lead, zinc, copper, mercury, into Suisun Bay, with the potential to release tens of tons more. This was happening in critical habitat for endangered Chinook salmon and delta smelt, in water where California had warned people to limit the fish they ate. Sejal Choksichuk of San Francisco Baykeeper had walked those decks. She described the paint chips and metal crunching under her feet. Her verdict on what the government had done was blunt. They were using the bay as a junkyard. In October 2007, Baykeeper, Ark Ecology, and the Natural Resources Defense Council sued. The Water Board joined a year later. The defense was not a foreign navy, it was a budget line, and in January 2010, a federal judge, Garland Burrell Jr., ruled that the decaying ships were illegally polluting the bay. A settlement followed. All 57 obsolete vessels would be removed, worst first, and hauled away by 2017. Here's the twist that should stop you. Once the government agreed to get rid of the ships, it almost could not. MARAD's disposal director, Sean Ireland, admitted they were at the mercy of the scrap steel market. The price had collapsed. These were symbols of American power, and he said they could not give them away for $10. Records showed the agency had understood the danger since at least 1997. The ships rotted anyway, because rot was cheaper than removal. So the fleet died the slow way. Crews scraped the decks first. Roughly 140 tons of toxic paint chips shoveled into barrels bound for hazardous waste disposal. Then the ships went. Most were towed through the Panama Canal to Brownsville, Texas, to be cut into scrap. A few were dismantled in the Mare Island dry docks, the same yard that once existed to bring them back to life. One by one, the rows emptied until the Cape Borda, the last ghost, was towed out. One ship escaped the breakers. In May 2012, the Iowa was scrubbed, repainted with 3,000 gallons of paint, and towed out under the Golden Gate Bridge on the weekend of the bridge's 75th birthday. She sits now at Berth 87 in Los Angeles, a museum. Her neighbors became razor blades. Cross the Benicia Martinez Bridge today, and the forest of steel is gone. The water is open. Salmon move through a bay that is measurably cleaner. But the anchorage isn't empty. A handful of gray hulls still float there because the reflex that filled it in 1946 never fully died, and newer surplus ships keep arriving. No enemy ever sank these ships. They waited 50 years for a war that never came, and in the end, the thing that finished them was their own paint, a reporter's records request, and a marsh that finally refused to stay quiet.